Welcome to How to Integrate ChatGPT's API with Python projects. I'm Joseph, and in this tutorial, you'll learn how to use Python's OpenAI library to integrate the ChatGPT API into your Python applications. With this, you can send text prompts to the API and receive AI-generated responses. You can also guide the AI's behavior with developer role messages and handle both simple text generation and more complex code creation tasks. You learn the fundamentals of using the ChatGPT API from Python and see code examples you can adapt for your own projects. So let's get started. For this tutorial, you'll need to know a few prerequisites that we'll see in a moment. Then, the key steps we will cover include obtaining your API key and installing the OpenAI package, calling the API to generate AI text responses, and getting structured outputs with Pydantic models. So let's check out the basic prerequisites you'll need in order to follow along with this tutorial. First, you should be familiar with Python concepts like Python functions, executing Python scripts, and Python virtual environments. Second, you'll need Python installed on your system. Third, an OpenAI account with API access and available credits. This is required to use the ChatGPT API. We'll see how you can obtain your API key from the OpenAI platform shortly. Don't worry if you're new to working with APIs. This tutorial will guide you through everything you need to know to get started with the ChatGPT API and implement AI features in your applications. So let's start with step 1. Before you can start making calls to the ChatGPT Python API, you'll need to obtain an API key and install the OpenAI Python library. Let's head over to the browser window and see how it's done. Go to platform.openai.com and sign into your account or create a new one if you don't have an account yet. Click on the settings icon in the top right corner and select API keys from the left-hand menu. Click the Create New Secret button to generate new API key. In the dialog that appears, give your key a descriptive name like Python tutorial key to help you identify it later. For the projects field, select your preferred project. Under permissions, select all to give your key full access to the API for development purposes. Click Create Secret Key to generate your API key. Copy the generated key immediately, as you won't be able to see it again after closing the dialog. Now head over to the terminal and set the OpenAI API key environment variable in your terminal session using the export command. Paste the API key that you copied earlier. The OpenAI Python library automatically looks for an environment variable named OpenAI API key when creating a client connection. By setting this variable in your terminal session, you'll authenticate your API request without exposing your key in the code. With your API key configured, create a new virtual environment using this command. And activate the virtual environment. Now we can install the OpenAI Python library using the pip command. Now that you have both your API key and the OpenAI library installed, you can verify that if everything works correctly. Create a Python file called verifysetup.py and add the code given in the description below. Run this file from your terminal, and if everything is set up correctly, you'll see the following output confirming the client was created successfully. This verification confirms that everything works well. If you see an error about missing API key, Then double check that if you have set up the environment variable correctly in your current terminal session. With that, we are ready to move to step 2, that is calling the ChatGPT Python API to generate an AI text response. Now that you have the library installed and your API key configured, you can start making API calls to OpenAI models that power the ChatGPT. The most basic operation is sending a text prompt and receiving a generated response. Start by creating a file called basic-chatgpt-call.py. In this code, you'll import the OpenAI class from the OpenAI module and create a client instance. The client automatically reads your API key from the OpenAI API key environment variable so that you don't need to pass it explicitly. Now you can send your first prompt to ChatGPT using the .responses.create method. This method takes two key parameters. The model parameter specifies which OpenAI model to use. Here we are using OpenAI's GPT-5 model, and the input parameter contains your prompt as a string. Let's run the file in the terminal and see which joke model comes up with. By the way, I don't quite get the AI generated jokes. You can also guide the AI's behavior by providing both developer instructions and user input. The input parameter that we saw earlier also accepts a list of messages represented as dictionaries, which lets you provide system level instructions alongside your user prompts. To demonstrate this, let's create an interactive Python coding assistant that only accepts Python related questions. Create a new file called codingassistant.py and add the code given in the description below. This code shows how to structure your input with role-based messages. The developer role sets system-level instructions that guide the AI's behavior, in this case by limiting responses to Python-related questions. The user role contains the actual request, which you capture interactively using the Python's input function. Let's see how models give different levels of priority to messages with different roles. The developer role takes precedence over user instructions, which is why it's effective for creating guardrails. Even if a user asks the assistant to ignore its instructions, the developer role constraints remain in effect. This hierarchy makes role-based messages essential for building reliable, specialized AI tools that maintain consistent behavior. Let's run the script to see how the developer role guides the model response. Let's ask a question related to Python, like how many keywords does Python have? The developer role also acts as a safeguard. By setting clear instructions in the developer role, you ensure consistent behavior and prevent the assistant from straying outside its intended purpose. So let's check out the model response. It says Python 3.7 to 3.9 had 35 keywords, and 3.10 and later versions have 37 keywords. Now let's run the script again and ask a non-Python related question, like how can I reverse a string in JavaScript? So as you can see, the model responded by saying that it can only help with Python related questions, and it gave a Python equivalent code for reversing a string. Understanding these basic API calls gives you the foundation you need to integrate ChatGPT into your applications. However, when you need responses in a specific format, working with plain text can be challenging. So let's move to step 3 and learn how to get structured outputs by using Pydantic models. The ChatGPT API supports structured outputs using Pydantic models, ensuring responses match your expected format. It is a validation library that lets you define data models using Python classes. The OpenAI Python library includes Pydantic as a dependency in most environments. However, if it isn't available, you can install it manually by running this respective pip command. Once you've made sure Pydantic is available, you can define this Pydantic model that represents the structure you expect from ChatGPT's response. In this code, you create a code output class that integrates from Pydantic's base model and defines four string attributes that represent the structure you expect in the response. When you use this model with the API, each attribute becomes a field that ChatGPT will populate. Let's create a new file called structuredoutput.py to see this in action. First, we define the code output class that we saw earlier. Notice that the script doesn't prompt the user for input. This shows that you can interact with the OpenAI API without requiring any user input at runtime. Besides using the .responses.parse function that we saw earlier, the other key difference here is the text format parameter, which tells the API to structure its response according to your Pydantic model. You pass the code output class directly to it, and the API ensures the response matches the structure. Let's run the code and see its response closely. So we can see in the output that we get the function name, the code, the explanation, and the example usage, just as we defined in the code output class. The structured output allows you to work with the response in your code. You can access individual fields as attributes, and Pydantic handles validations automatically. If the API returns data that doesn't match your model structure, you'll get a validation error instead of silently processing the incorrect data. You can use the structured data in templates, databases, or pass it to other functions without additional processing. Cool. Now you'll learn how to integrate the ChatGPT API into your Python projects. Here are a few things to keep in mind when integrating LLMs in your applications. Always keep your API keys secure, use environment variables, or secure key management services in production applications. Add proper error handling to your API calls. The OpenAI library can raise exceptions for many reasons. Wrap your API calls in try and except blocks and handle common exceptions gracefully. Monitor your API usage through OpenAI dashboard. Different models have different pricing, and costs accumulate based on number of tokens processed. For chatbot applications, maintain conversation history by including previous messages in the input field. This allows the AI to maintain context across multiple exchanges. Be mindful that longer conversations consume more tokens and increase costs. With that, thanks for watching. You can find all the code resources used in this video in the description below. And let me know about any questions you have in the comments below.